clickbait headline convention, Taplines listener, only 90s kids will remember. Well, today, we're going to be looking back at a 90s moment that barely anyone remembers. A blink and you'll miss it manifestation of the excitement of craft brewing's first wave heyday that appeared for just a couple brief years in Los Angeles at the beginning of that decade. It was a brewpub, then still a vanguard concept, with a $6 million brew house imported from West Germany and a high-flying chef with unimpeachable bona fides to front the operation. Beer history buffs and Angelinos of a certain age may know where this is headed, but for the rest of you, I'm talking about a spot called Eureka, and I'm talking about it with the one and only Wolfgang Puck. That's right, listener. Today on Taplines, we're joined by chef himself. He of Spago and Chinois and so many other successful restaurants, the James Beard Lifetime Achiever, for a candid, clear-eyed look at how one of the loudest salvos in elevating the role of craft beer in dining, as Tom Asatelli put it in his 2013 book, The Audacity of Hops, met such a quick and unceremonious demise, and what chef learned from its collapse. Here's a hint. When the kitchen is clicking, but the brewery business ain't, well, your brewpub might be headed for trouble. But I'll let chef tell the tale. It's Wolfgang Puck, it's the erstwhile Eureka, it's confronting the brewpub conundrum, and it's all right here, right now, on Von Pear's Taplines. We got a special treat for you today, Taplines listeners. We're joined in the Taplines virtual studio by a man who needs no introduction, so why am I even going to give him one? Let's just let him say hello. Wolfgang Puck, welcome to the Taplines podcast.
Hello, good to be with you guys.
Thanks so much for joining us, Wolfgang. Chef, where are you joining us from today?
Well, I'm right here in West Hollywood, in Los Angeles, in my office still, because Spago is closed today, Chinois is closed. So I do a little office work, go back and look who I forgot to send an email to or a text to and things like that,
You're playing a little catch-up.
It's good to be a little bit in the office. Yeah, a little catch-up.
Very good. Wow, I had no idea, Chef, but you and I have at least one thing in common, which is occasionally we get a little behind on our emails. So I'm glad to know I'm not the only one.
No, I'm not a good guy on the email, so I think I have Lavina and Susan, two very capable people who can do it for me.
Well, we're glad to have gotten in touch with them, and through them, gotten in touch with you because, Chef, you mentioned, Spago and Chinois, obviously some of the sort of most recognizable names in American dining. You mentioned that you're in West Hollywood. I think, so many of our listeners know you as the culinary talent that you've established over decades-long career. Many of our listeners who are more plugged into the beer industry side of things may not know that Wolfgang Puck had a brief affair with the craft beer industry, a few decades ago, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We appreciate you being willing to take a trip down memory lane with us.
Yep, why not, huh?
Why not, man? So we talk about the Taplines time machine, and we usually hand it over to our guests to decide what year they would like to start the story in. The story, of course, that I'm referring to is the tale of Eureka, your venture into the American craft brewing industry. Chef, in your mind, where does that story start? When does it start?
The story really started in Austria. In Austria, in the old time, there was no refrigerated truck. There was no refrigerator. I remember they had, where they were brewing beer, where I grew up in a little town, they cut their ice from the lakes. They had 3 feet deep ice on the lake. They cut it and put it in the cellar, and it stayed forever there. So that's how they used to keep the beer cold, Mm-hmm. And I think they didn't have a machine to pasteurize it. So it was consumed totally locally there. So it didn't go out in the sun or on trucks somewhere. So for me, in Austria, you see a lot of breweries with a restaurant. And, I thought there's nothing better than having a goulash or a sausage and have a fresh beer on top, and different kinds, for different flavors, with different alcohol degrees and everything. So that's where it really started. So then I went to France, learned about French cooking, and obviously in part of France, certain part beer is also big. And then I came to America, worked in some great restaurants, and then I opened Spago, Chinois, and then they were so successful, and I said, I can do anything it will be successful. So with a friend of mine who used to run a winery, we decided to do a restaurant brewery, where like 70% of the building was the brewery and 30% the restaurant. And so we were supposed to, in our plan, to do 1 million cases of beer a year, which is, a small brewery in comparison to the large one. It's a craft brewery. And we had a great restaurant with it. So we started it out, I think it was in 1989. Obviously, there were not many local breweries, not many breweries which brew their own beer and so forth around. I know we in LA, we were probably one of the only ones. Who did that. And so when we opened, it was a smash hit. The restaurant was doing amazing. I remember in 89, we did like $5 million a year in business. We actually did more business at Eureka than at Spago.
Whoa.
So, which was really amazing. I remember we had the birthday party for Sean Connery, and and I think it was his 60th birthday, and we made sausages. I actually brought a sausage maker over from Munich, from Germany, to make traditional Weißwurst and Bratwurst and all that stuff too, because I grew up with it too, but Munich was very famous because we know the Oktoberfest. And so the restaurant did really amazing. The beer in the restaurant was amazing. It was unfiltered, and we had, obviously traditional lager. We had some Pilsner. We had some dark beer. We had some golden beer. So all different. And then we added sometimes different flavors for different occasions. Made it stronger than, with more higher in alcohol. So, but mainly the beer on tap at the brewery and the restaurant at the brewery was amazing. And we made food to go with it. So the food was really, obviously, we had this German sausage maker come over. And then I had different influence for wherever they drink beer. So I said, okay, Mexican food is great with beer. We made some amazing quesadillas, I remember. And then we had obviously some Austrian dishes like goulash and some Asian dishes. So it was a mixture of it, but really good. And we had a great clientele. The restaurant was doing really well. The beer was delicious. But then we also were supposed to sell beer in to the supermarkets and, liquor
in the
stores
off-premise.
And yeah. And so because we didn't pasteurize the beer, we made it a traditional German way, which they call, the Reinheitsgebot, where you don't add anything, you don't do anything.
Of course.
Just keep it all natural. And so the beer, because it stayed outside on the trucks and everything, it did not hold up in the bottle. I remember I went on a cruise. I did some cooking classes on the Crystal cruise line. And I bought 2 pallets of my beer. And I went with my father to the bar and said, do you have my beer? Do you have Eureka beer? The guy didn't know anything. And then I told the guy who was running the hotel on the ship, and I said, okay, we brought 2 pallets of beer, so there's none in the bar. They put them in the bar the next day. I go with my father and we poured the beer and I tasted it. I said, this is not right. This bottle is not good. And it had a very weird cloudy color.
Yeah.
Then I opened another one and another one, and they were all the same. So I said, we cannot serve this beer. It's not good enough. So something is wrong because it wasn't pasteurized. So we had this big problem of not pasteurizing the beer to sell it commercially. the restaurant continued to be really successful. And then finally, I think after 2.5 years or 3 years, we had to shut down the business. I actually got another investors, but I couldn't get rid of my partners there. And so then I had an Austrian brewery actually coming over and helping me with the beer. But because of the partners, they said, we don't need these guys. We do it ourselves. And they said, well, we are owners. We are not leaving. So I said, well, then I'm leaving. So then I said, okay, guys, we're going to close the restaurant and you can do it. And naturally, they closed everything down.
Yeah.
So it was a big lesson for me, really, to do things I can control, And here, the beer, even if it's not complicated, but you have to set it up the right way and do it the right way to have a chance to be successful. And even in the old time, there were not that many microbreweries like the way it's today. But I still think we could have been successful. And one of the main reasons I did it, I thought we could create a brand, and which is very valuable too, So at that time, they had Anchor Steam and some others, but very few breweries actually who bottled their beer, who had a bottling line. And I remember we had everything from Steinecker in Germany, a big brewing equipment manufacturer, and he sent it to us, and we put it on a lease payment, so we didn't pay anything for it, but it was an amazing, he's like the Rolls-Royce of the brewing equipment. And then I told him, okay, I'm so sorry, we cannot pay the lease. Can you give us a little more time? And so he said, okay, I'm coming over to see you. He comes over on a Friday night, goes to Eureka. It was so busy and so noisy. It was like Oktoberfest in LA. And he said, are you screwing me around? Do you look how busy the restaurant is? I said, yes, but the brewery is different. The restaurant is different than the brewery. And so he said, no, I'm not going to give you credit any longer. You have to pay. If not, I take the equipment back. So at the end, he had a hard head and I had a hard head, and, we gave him the equipment back, and that was the end of Eureka.
Sure. So that was what, like, Wolfgang, 1993 or so, I want to say, was when Eureka
92,
closed?
I think
92?
so.
Yeah, 92.
Yeah.
So it was only open for a brief time. You said you opened in 89. You had a lot of success right when it opened. The restaurant is full. It's doing more business at one point than Spago was, which is no easy feat. I mean, Spago, was and continues
at that time the most famous restaurant in America. Maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were sort of bright spots of what Eureka could maybe accomplish. I want to back up a little bit because you describe your childhood in Austria. You describe sort of some of the program that you put together with your partners on the beer side of things at Eureka. What were you drinking at this time? What were you drinking? Like, what kind of beers did you grow up with, Wolfgang?
Well, I still remember I drink beer in Austria. My grandmother used to have a dark beer from the local brewery, and even that, like on Sunday when my parents wasn't there, my grandmother used to drink a glass of the beer, and she used to give us kids, my sister and myself, a little beer, and we put a little more sugar in it and drank the beer, that way we can fall asleep. And we had the regular lager beer. That's what I remember was the most popular one, what everybody was drinking. But I didn't like the lager beer as a kid because it was bitter and everything. They had a lot of hop in it, so But, where I grew up, we didn't drink wine. Mainly it was beer. With food, whenever we had lunch or dinner, was always with the beer, not with a glass of wine. People drank wine when they went to a bar or went out, but not with food. It was interesting. Everybody drank beer.
Yeah. What were people drinking in the late 80s, early 90s in Los Angeles? What was the beer scene like?
Well, in the 80s, the big news were California wines.
Yep.
So that was really the main thing. All of a sudden, California wines came on and were really famous, and where everybody thought about Cabernet and Chardonnay. That was the big thing, in restaurants for sure. And I think it was so much so that, like when I built Chinois, our restaurant in Santa Monica, where Asian food actually would be good with beer too. But I built a big wine rack behind the bar. I said, oh, we're going to sell California wines, with our Asian food. And had the bar, the bottles from vodka and tequila, whatever, on the side, so you barely saw them. So you only saw the wine rack because I wanted to sell wine because that was the it thing at that time, Everybody talked about it. Everybody talked about the California wines, and obviously Italian or French was too, but California wine really was the beginning.
Yeah. And you were in California, obviously, so everyone's even
totally.
that much more excited about it. Yeah. What was the beer scene like? Like, you mentioned that there were some craft breweries. I mean, obviously, you had Anchor that had been going for a long time in San Francisco. In '89, Sierra Nevada up in Chico, California opens. Ken Grossman, co-founds Sierra Nevada. So that's just starting to come on. Who were the other players that you remember in the brewing industry at that time?
I really remember Jim Cook really well because he started Sam Adams a little bit before, and he started to grow it, and he also started to market it. So he was really the first one who started small, the Boston Beer Company, and then he gradually expanded it, and it became a brand where people like it, where people seem to like it. And at that time, he was probably nationally one of the only ones who did it. Now, every city has little breweries, brewpubs. They make their beer, some in smaller quantities, some just for the restaurants, some where they have a little bit a bigger facility. So I think to me, one thing was I thought we had really the best brewery restaurant for sure. It was not about making just cheap beer food like just sausages or whatever.
Right.
We made our own bread. We made everything ourselves. We had the charcuterie plate where we made our own coppa. We made our own salamis. We made our own saucisson sec like in Lyon. And so we really were way ahead. We had great pastries, and I think my ex-wife did a beautiful restaurant too. She looked like a factory in a modern way, So cool. I think everything was really well. And we were not in a neighborhood where there were so many people. We were in an industrial park. And so you didn't have any foot traffic there. You really had to go there on purpose, But because people like Mike Ovitz from CIA, he brought his customers there. I remember we had Barbara Walters there, Julia Roberts there. So many of the people used to like it because they used to love the Austrian dishes and the beer.
Yeah. That's it's a good point, right? Like the idea of a brewery restaurant in an industrial park maybe in 1989 was not as familiar, although, as 3 decades later, the idea of breweries opening tap rooms with food in post-industrial, parts of a city, a warehouse district or an old factory district is much more familiar. I mean, you guys were in that way, and it sounds like maybe in other ways too, we're ahead of the curve there, Wolfgang.
I think so too. I think it was ahead of the curve, but I think the business, since I was already a retailer too, I had restaurants where we sell alcohol. So I had to go to Sacramento and help them change the law so that way I can be an owner too. So I owned only 10% of it. That was one of the factors. I said, I only can own 10%, and I put all this work in it. It's crazy,
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I said, unless I get somebody who can really operate the brewery the way it should be, then if not, why work so hard and for nothing?
Yeah, totally. Chef, you mentioned sort of that at that era, in the late 80s, California wines are sort of the big story and there's a ton of excitement about it. You mentioned organizing Chinois around, California wines. This was also a moment, maybe a little bit before, but beer is about to come on very strong, right? We see the first craft beer surge in the late 80s or the late 90s, excuse me. So, another 3-4 years after Eureka closed, and you would see this big first wave craft beer boom. I'm curious to get your take as someone who lived through that and worked through that and developed these different, restaurant concepts, one of which was around, the brewing industry. What was the difference that you were seeing selling wine against a food program as opposed to selling beer against a food program? I mean, it seems significant.
Well, for us in the restaurant business, the upscale restaurant business,
Yeah.
we want to sell wine. Why? Because it costs much more money,
Sure.
Even at that time, a beer was $5, a bottle of wine or a glass of wine was $8,
Yeah.
And I think the costs were really good for us for the beer. If we sold it in a restaurant, I mean, we made really good money with the beer. So the restaurant was very profitable and everything. But we were supposed to produce 1 million cases a year. And I think we produced like 35,000 or something like that.
Wow.
So that's,
yeah.
that was not a good thing. So, we live and learn. I think I should not have created one company. The brewery and the restaurant were all once. If it would have been separated, maybe we would have had a chance. But I think it's very difficult to go into a business where you only can own 10% and you have to work so hard to get it going. So that's one of the reasons I stopped it.
Sure. That makes sense. And the price point is also, sort of, that definitely makes sense, right? Like there had to have been a lot of, I'm curious, like when you remember walking the floor or speaking with customers, how much was the price resistance a factor? I mean, you guys were making beautiful beer. It was unpasteurized. Like this was a product that was not really available to the American drinker in many places. So on one hand, that's a premium, right? But on the other, American drinker just isn't going to pay more than $5, $6 for a pint of beer. I'm curious how much you sort of encountered that resistance at Eureka.
I don't think there was a resistance at all, because we served them in nice glasses. So it was really, I think, a elegant way to drink beer to go with the food. So I think there was no resistance at all, because you can get a really good beer, for a reasonable price, in comparison to wine or liquors.
Sure.
So I think it was very popular, and people drink beer. Beer is a very popular thing all over the place. If it's rich people, poor people, they all like beer. And I still drink it, even with my still bitter taste in my mouth. I think I still have hops in between my teeth. After that, I stopped drinking beer. I said,
"No, come on, really?"
Oh, totally.
Oh no, you gave up beer because of how Eureka went? Oh no.
Yeah, well, it's a good reason.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But do you remember? So in the aftermath of that, like I said, the craft beer industry would start to rise and have what we now know as its sort of first boom, right, in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Did you ever think about revisiting the Eureka concept?
I thought many times to revisit it, but I said I have to find the right people to do it. I don't want to have to worry about the beer, about who is brewing it, how the bottling line is working, did they pasteurize it or not, and everything. I think you need really somebody, and then have somebody to market it also, I think one of the problem was, like especially in LA, the restaurants, the better restaurants, they bought, because they were my friends maybe, they bought a few cases, but they never really sold it, I heard one of the guys from a very well-known restaurant at that time said, "Oh, you know what? we don't gonna make Wolfgang any richer. Fuck him, That's it.
So he wasn't.
Even he was, even he was a friend of mine,
Yeah.
So, but he was, some people are jealous when people are successful instead of doing the opposite,
Yeah.
I love when friends are successful, it's a good thing. So I think I had a big resistance there from other restaurant people.
I never thought of that, but yeah, sure. I mean, gosh, they must have been, as you say. I mean, you were at that moment the hottest, most well-recognized chef in the country, man. Of course there's going to be some jealousy.
Yeah. So it was hard for me to go and market it. And, people always bought a little bit, and then that was it.
Well, plus you were busy. You had 2 other restaurants going on. You had the other parts of the business.
We had Chinois, we had Spago. I did consulting for the mansion in Dallas and the Remington in Houston. I did consulting for an airline. We had Spago in Tokyo. So it wasn't like that I was out of a job, It was
right.
But I thought if I look back at my history, which were the most recognizable and the most unique concepts. Obviously, it started with Spago, with the open kitchen in a fine dining restaurant that didn't exist before. Then Chinois was the first fusion restaurant because I didn't learn how to cook Chinese food or Vietnamese food or whatever. I loved the taste of it and I imagined how to do it. How would I do it with my techniques, instead of the Asian techniques? And then the third one was Eureka. Eureka is a concept, the whole package was amazing. When you walked in, you saw the 3 big brewing kettles in front of you, and when you sat at the bar, you could see the beer being cooked and everything. I mean, it was really, to me, an amazing experience, really. It wasn't just like that you drank a beer, but you see it actually being made, and you could go in the back to the tanks where the fermentation tanks were and everything. So it was an exciting project. I still feel bad that it didn't work out. And I remember I had all these famous investors from Barbra Streisand to Jack Nicholson and so forth. And Barbra Streisand 10 years later said, the only restaurant I invested in failed.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's, well, sorry, Barbara, if you're listening. I'm sure this is not how Wolfgang wanted it to work out either, But
I lost the most. So I told her, I remember she used to make at that time millions a night already. I remember in 93 when we opened the MGM, so that was just a year after we closed.
Yeah.
She did a show in Vegas 2 nights at the MGM. She got paid $20 million.
Holy smokes. Yeah. Okay. Well, then, Barbara, you're doing okay. Eureka.
She's doing okay.
Yeah, she's doing okay.
A little tax write-off was okay.
That's right. Chef, I want, if we could, to think about, you mentioned the idea you guys were aiming for at one point 1 million cases annually that you were hoping to sell in the off-premise and to fellow restaurant operators to sell in the on-premise. That's a totally different business than the one that you were, at that point had the most experience with. Like selling packaged beer is a challenge even today in 2024. And certainly back then when the marketplace was mostly dominated by the big 3, by Miller, Coors, and Bud. The American consumer maybe wasn't as ready to go out and buy smaller breweries that they weren't familiar with, smaller brands. Talk a little bit about that, what you were seeing in the off-premise. I mean, obviously it didn't work out the way you'd hoped, but what was your thesis going into that brand building part of the business?
Well, I really thought that the idea of doing it and building a brand would be really a great thing, that we can build it. The restaurant made money, the restaurant had great customers and everything. So we got name recognition just from the restaurant, so people knew, and they said, we go to Eureka, we had the beer there too. And So it was a great way to start it out without having a marketing budget, because the restaurant was really the marketeer for the beer. That's the way I saw it at that time. I said, we always, when we open a restaurant, like I remember we opened a Postrio in San Francisco around that time too, and it became a huge success in San Francisco. So I was thinking, I cannot do anything wrong. Everything gonna be perfect. Chinois was well, Spago was well, Postrio did well. So I said, life is good. So I forgot though that in business, it's better to do something you do and you know well than something you can control. So that's I learned. For me, I remember when Ronald Reagan came to the restaurant, I gave him a Eureka hat, and he said, "Oh, you went to Eureka? I went to Eureka too." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Yeah, I went to Eureka College in Illinois." So it was funny. I still remember. But he walked around with my Eureka hat. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's funny. Do you remember any conversations with distributors from back then? Like, were they excited to carry the product? Like, what's your recollection?
At the beginning, everybody was really excited about it, and people really wanted it and said, "Oh, finally something new in our industry." And they started to hear about the restaurant and everything. So at the beginning, it was really good. But then the buzz got out that the beer doesn't hold up. So we had to buy back the beer and everything. It became a difficult thing. And, you don't get that many chances when
Totally.
you try to launch something. So you better have it right, have your ducks in a row and have everything ready. And, I didn't know. At that time, I didn't even think about it, that the beer will spoil if it's not pasteurized, if it's not kept refrigerated at all the time, if the pasteurizing or the filling room was not completely bacteria-free and everything. So it's a lot of science going in it. If you want to do it that way, it's possible. Do it without pasteurizing, but also it's very difficult.
And you got to sell it quick. Yeah.
It doesn't hold up long, and if you let it sit outside or in trucks which are not refrigerated, so then it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
So that's what I learned. I saw the positive side of it. I think I didn't really check in and said, what can go wrong?
Yeah.
So my lawyer didn't tell me. Now my business lawyer always tells me, whenever I do a restaurant, he always tells me not to do it because so many things can go wrong. I said, okay, I'm going to check them off and see if there's enough positive sides.
Yeah. But not this time around. And Eureka. Yeah. What did something that became more common, a decade later or so, decade and a half later, was the big strategic conglomerates like Anheuser-Busch, like Molson Coors, would acquire, breweries. This was happening in the late aughts and the early, in the early 2010s. That became a much more common dynamic in the market. But back in 91, 92, when maybe you were, starting to have conversations about the future of Eureka, did any of the big companies, the big breweries, try to contact you to get a hold of? I mean, you'd built at least partially successful business. Yeah.
I dealt with an Austrian beer company, Ottakringer, out of Vienna.
Okay.
They have and they're very well respected, very well known in Austria, and they owned a few other breweries too. And so I contacted them because a friend of mine was on the board. He was like the chairman of the board of the company. He wasn't the CEO, he didn't run it, but he was the chairman. And so they came over and everything, and I was actually excited. They tried to buy the brand, not for much money, but I told them it will be a very good reason if they can run the beer and do it properly. That way, for them to start out Ottakringer beer in LA or in New York or in Chicago would be very expensive. And here with me, we were already very well known. They have a good base already, and they could support it at the beginning. And I thought it would be a profitable business. So, but then I could not get rid of my partners. I had 3 partners in there, 3 general partners, and that was it. So I said, okay. And I remember I had my friend Jean-Paul de Joria, who at that time owned Paul Mitchell, and before he started Patron Tequila. He was interested in investing more money in it. But then I said, if I cannot change the brewery, I won't do it. You know, and so my partners, they dug their heads in, and I said, okay, I'm not gonna do it then.
Yeah,
And then JP didn't put money in it, so we had to close it down.
Yeah. And you just to you mentioned it earlier in our conversation, you were only about 10% of Eureka.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I
so-
only could own 10%. And to get that, I had to change the law. You know?
Yeah. Go up to
If
Sacramento.
not, I had to go to and Willie Brown and all these guys up there helped me to get it through. But it had a limit on it and everything. So if not, if there wouldn't be the tied house law, you know, the brewery would own every brewpub in the world, you know.
Right.
They all would be Busch or Anheuser or Miller
Heineken.
pubs, you know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a unique quirk of the American system, right? And every state has a different way of administering it. But the 3-tier system is one that I think a lot of our listeners get very frustrated by because brewers in the trade, they struggle to sort of find a route to market that makes sense for their business, that the margin is going to be worth doing, and the 3-tier system poses a lot of obstacles to that. Then as now, Chef. Sorry, go ahead.
It's a good thing that it is like that, because if not, a lot of small entrepreneurs, they would never be able to get off the ground. You know,
it's true.
I think it's a good thing. If not, I think it would be really big companies would even run more than what they do already. It's already without that, it would be impossible. There would be 10 companies in America, and then the rest we would work for them.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. I think pros and cons to the system, and certainly something that we've talked about at length on the podcast, and I've talked about in my reporting in the past. Chef, I want to sort of look, sort of back up to present day. You're probably the most culinarily accomplished guest that we've ever had here on Taplines, and frankly, the most accomplished that we ever might have here on Taplines. You have the benefit of seeing so much more of the American culinary landscape than I ever will, and then a lot of our listeners ever will. One of the things that I've reported on in the past, and that the American beer industry has been interested, to sort of try to crack the code on, is the idea of like beer as a culinary product, right? Like it's an agricultural product, it's a culinary product. Hey, we can make fine beer just like we can make fine wine. It can be paired with food. A decade ago, the craft brewing industry was insistent about this idea of beer as a culinary product and something that could really stand up not only in terms of flavor, but in terms of price point with something like wine. I'm curious, having seen as much as you've seen of the way the American hospitality industry has evolved and the way the different beverage alcohol categories interact with it and factor into it, do you see a place for, beer in the way that it fit in at Eureka? Do you see that in the marketplace these days in 2024?
Well, it's an interesting thing because, there are people who drink beer with dinner. It's just not in the majority. Is a waiter going to try to sell a bottle of beer instead of a half bottle of wine? No. A half bottle of wine these days costs, maybe $80 if it's a good wine. And then if you have a bottle of beer, going to cost $15 or $12. So, and then the tip, how much you're going to pay, $2 or $3, or it's going to be $15, So that's a big difference.
Sure.
And the intention of it. Now, certain dishes go better with beer, that's for sure. Like for me, drinking wine with goulash, I wouldn't even think about it. When I go skiing, I have a ham. I finish skiing and I sit down at the bar and I have a ham sandwich with some fresh horseradish. It reminds me of Austria. It reminds me of beer. So I have a beer, but I always put it in a wine glass. I like to drink it out of a nice glass. I don't like heavy glasses like that.
Yeah.
So
no imperial
I think
pint.
That's part of it. How do we gonna sell it, the beer? Because if you put it in a big pint, it gets warm. And, I know there's the English who love it warm. Like, I don't like to go to a pub in London because the beer is flat and warm. So
it starts warm and it gets flatter and warmer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's their preference.
But
That's not my preference.
I think it might be interesting to see it about the packaging. Maybe to put it in a bigger bottle, like in a 750 or a liter or something like that, and then keep it in an ice bucket, and then serve it in a nice glass. I think people would like it. It's not, sometimes it's how you present it, and I think often the presentation for serving beer in more upscale restaurants, it's just the same way as they would do it in a cheap place somewhere, in these big beer glasses. I like it out of a finer glass, and I like it with a stem glass, and why not, and then it will go okay with the thing. And then I think also the breweries can add different kind of flavors to go with different kind of food. I actually thought at Chinois, I tried to acquire the property next door, but then they didn't sell it. My reason was, I said, I'm going to build a small brewery there and make it really different, get really different beers with different flavors added to it and everything for different occasion or for different dishes to have a bearing and say, okay, this is a lager beer, but we added a little bit of ginger to it or a little bit of jasmine to it.
Sure.
And give it a different taste, not to overpower the dish, but to have interesting flavors.
I mean, that sounds like a really fun project. Were you going to try to do that after Eureka closed?
Yeah.
So you still wanted another shot at another brewery?
I want revenge. I want revenge, I need a rematch.
I like
Maybe
that.
one day.
I like that. Well, but the beers that you're describing, ginger, lavender, maybe a little bit of rosemary, whatever, working with these culinary flavors, it sounds really interesting to me as a drinker. But from the Austrian perspective, from the German perspective, those are violations of the Reinheitsgebot. That's not pure beer at all.
When I opened Chinois, I had so many Chinese restaurateurs send me notes, nasty notes. How dare you cook Chinese food?
Sure.
You're not Chinese. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. This is a misrepresentation of our culture, and you name it, what they send these words. And, at the end, I think we did what we did, and they do what they did. And I think maybe we could create a whole new category about it, about specialty beers. And I'm sure some people wouldn't like it, and some people said, wow, this is really interesting, I mean, who would have ever thought that Red Bull gonna be so big, Who gonna drink this sweet lemonade with terrible flavor?
Yeah.
People put it in their vodka. The kids put it in their vodka, stay up all night and drink it. I mean, I tasted it. I said, why would anybody buy that yet?
Yeah.
It's owned by a friend of mine, but he passed away a year and a half ago. But never underestimate the palate of the American people.
I'm so glad you said that, Wolfgang, because that was my next question was, you've also watched the American palate grow and change since you opened and closed Eureka, since you've been in business. Where is the American palate these days as opposed to where it was when you began? Has there been any progress in your view?
Well, I think in the old time, the taste was very close-minded. People didn't even accept that American chefs were not really doing anything. Very few. They had to come from Italy, from France, or from China, or Japan, you name it, but not from the U.S. So that has changed. But I think one of the things what I saw in the 80s, for example, when we started Spago in 1982, the traditional restaurants, New York, Washington, maybe Boston a little bit, they had this traditional restaurant they had to do a certain way, Like I remember in the old time when you walked into La Grenouille or all these French restaurants, they had a little table outside with appetizers, with desserts and everything. There was a certain style. When I started Spago in LA, and I think it worked in LA better because we didn't have that tradition. So we were more open-minded, and people were excited about having something new, something they never saw really, because at that time, having a pizza with smoked salmon, even today, people know about it, or serving raw tuna in a tablecloth restaurant, not in a Japanese, that didn't exist. So I started to mix things together already then in '82, and I think people were receptive to it. People filled up the restaurant every day. We were more successful than any other restaurant, and we are still successful today by trying to really figure out how we're going to combine innovation and tradition. Tradition is great, but also innovation is important, because if you stay still all the time, it's boring.
Yeah. Those are wise words, Chef. We're in the back half of the episode here, and I wanted to, we've reflected on how Eureka did. Obviously it didn't work out the way you wanted to, but you've been so candid about, sort of the struggles it had. The craft beer industry in the United States these days is also having struggles. Growth is not happening in the same way that it had over the course of the past, decade and a half or so. Brewers are selling right around the same amount of beer, or maybe even a little bit less than they have been over the course of the past few years, right? So you're seeing a mature industry struggle with the idea of tradition versus innovation, as you mentioned. And I'm curious, again, I don't mean to say that you have all the answers, but you have more experience than I think, certainly than I do, but also most of our listeners and most craft brewers have not been in the business of selling American, consumers the food and drink that's going to excite them and that's going to seem new and fresh to them. What's your perspective, or what would your recommendations be to industries that are maturing and that are trying to figure out how to do innovative new things while also respecting their tradition? You've done it a bunch of times before. How do you approach a problem like that?
Well, both of them can live together. You can have a good lager beer with your goulash, but you can also, we have an Asian restaurant, have a lager beer with different flavors to it, And, when I saw the first time Corona, they put a lime on top of the beer and then some put it in there. I said, this is terrible. Why you want to have a lime with the beer? Yet it became this amazing brand, So I think, why not make beer with different flavors in it? Because people are accepting it, with different fruits or the things like that to add to it. I think it's certainly feasible, but you have to give people a reason why to try it, Now we are not so stuck on the past as much. We are ready for innovation. People are ready to try new things. People love new restaurants. And I'm sure they will love new kinds of beer with different flavors. So I think, and then if you give them a reason to get the right food to match it with, I think it will be a good thing. I'm not saying I'm out of the beer business yet. I'm still young, so one day I'm going to go back into it and you will hear from me.
Well, listen, man, if you're ever looking for a silent partner, I'll shut up. I don't have any money, but I'll be your silent partner. How about that, Wolfgang? And I'll let you do what you need to do. I'll clean up around the fermenters. I'll be the janitor. How about that?
Okay, you keep everything clean.
It's very important.
Supervise there.
Very important.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, listeners, you heard it here first. Wolfgang Puck, chef, is not fully out of the beer business. Clearly, chef, over the course of our conversation, I've gotten this sense that you still would like another redo, maybe another crack at the beer industry. So I'm glad to hear that this is not the end for the beer your beer aspirations.
No, if I would be a fighter, I would have signed for a rematch for sure, So I think I need redemption.
There we go. Okay, Wolfgang Puck, thank you so much for joining us here on Taplines. It's been a pleasure going down memory lane with you. Obviously, Eureka, an important turning point for the American craft brewing industry, even though it didn't shake out the way you had hoped. thanks so much for joining us, Wolfgang. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for bringing me on as your silent partner in this this
Okay.
new brewery, in this new brewer project.
Okay, cheers.
All right. Cheers.
All right.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.